Today's story begins with a shape and a sentence you probably remember from school. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. The Pythagorean theorem, the cornerstone of geometry, and for most of us, a vague high school memory of triangles and frustration. You actually probably haven't even used it since geometry. Behind this familiar formula lies the story of a man who may have been the most influential mathematician of the ancient world, but also one of the most mysterious figures. A man whose life blended science, philosophy, and the supernatural until it became almost impossible to separate them. This is Pythagoras of Samos, and this is the Cult of Pythagoreanism. Our story begins on the island of Samos. Around 560 BC, a child was born under the brilliant Aegean sun. His father, Nisarchus, I don't have a degree in ancient Greek names. I do have a history degree, but not in ancient Greek names. So his father, Nisarchus, was said to be a merchant, or in other accounts, a gem engraver, who traveled across the eastern Mediterranean. His mother, Pythis, was rumored to descend from the island's founding line. Pythis was noble on Samos, if not divine, sent directly to Samos by the gods. According to later writers, the oracle at Delphi had foretold his birth. A little side note here, if you hear some high-pitched weeking in the background, it is our guinea pigs who are also in the same room as my recording devices. They just bring some life to the room, man. I love them, so I'm not going to cut them out. If you hear them, you hear them. They're saying hi to you. They're great. All right, let's get back to it. According to those later writers, the oracle at Delphi had foretold the birth of Pythagoras, claiming that the child would surpass all men in beauty and wisdom. Now, whether that prophecy was real or invented later doesn't really matter. For the Greeks, this prophecy fit what Pythagoras would become. Samos itself was alive. It was a living, breathing island. There was trade everywhere. There was ideas, merchants, builders, poets, philosophers. Everyone had lived on this island and they were working together. Ultimately, it was really just a beautiful place to live and learn. There was a lot of engineering going on. There was bridges, harbors. There was a lot of philosophical debates. There was a lot of celebrations like festivals. It really was just a cradle of thought. And really, Pythagoras thrived there. It was great for him to grow up in that area. Due to the fact that he grew up in this thriving culture, Pythagoras wanted to explore the world. He left Samos behind and he began to travel. This journey would last quite a few years and is going to shape the rest of his life. He studied with priests in ancient Egypt. He learned the secrets of astronomy in Babylon. And if you believe some of the later accounts that came to be in his life, he journeyed even further. He went to Persia, Phoenicia, maybe even India. There's even a story that he went and studied under the Magi and conversed with Jewish scholars. So from the start, we have these fantastical tales about Pythagoras and his journeys, just kind of trying to build up the knowledge that he had gained. It's difficult to know how much of this is actually true, but we do know that when Pythagoras returned to Greece, he brought something profound with him. An idea that the universe is not just the reality we live in, but it can go further and it can be explained by numbers. For Pythagoras, math wasn't just a tool, it was a language. For him and later his followers, as you come to see him, it is a divine language of creation. The Pythagorean theorem, all of it encompasses an idea. Of course, you guys know him by a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Of course, that's his defining trait. But here is where we see the first of Pythagoras' controversies. If you believe historians' accounts, which by all accounts you should believe historians, the Babylonians and the Indians seem to have known the Pythagorean theorem earlier than what we perceive it as being known. There are clay tablets from Mesopotamia that show the understanding of right-angled triangles long before Pythagoras. So, perhaps Pythagoras didn't discover the Pythagorean theorem, but here's what's important. He brought it back to Greece, and he turned it into a rule, a symbol. He redefined Grecian mathematics. He applied it in Greece, which at the time was the knowledgeable center of the world, at least the Western world, and he was able to make it into something that was more than just a mathematical equation, as we'll find out, but also just in everyday life, the mathematical equation. Walter Burkett, he's a German historian who has studied Pythagoras for a lot of his life. He, and I quote, has said, Pythagoras made numbers sacred. It wasn't just the theorem that mattered. It was everything it represented. For Pythagoras, it represented harmony, order, reason. It represents the very universe in itself. And we can see that representation in some of Pythagoras's legends, I want to say. For instance, there's a story that one day Pythagoras is passing a blacksmith's forge. As he walked by, he noticed that the ringing of hammers striking the metal produced different sounds, each one of them slightly different. So, of course, Pythagoras, being the learner he was, went to the blacksmiths, and he asked them, he started to question them a little bit about their tools, and he found out that with each hammer strike, it made a different noise, but that noise depended on the weight of the hammers. So he went home, and the legend says he immediately went home. He immediately went home, and he began experimenting. He tied strings at different lengths. He plucked them. He made these basically inventions to make music because he wanted to understand at a deeper level why this was happening. And he realized that the pleasing combinations, he created the intervals, the octaves that we hear nowadays. They followed exact mathematical ratios, and he found that out. He experimented with the hammers, with the musical instruments, with the strings, and he found those mathematical ratios. Pythagoras, it was amazing to him. It was a revelation. He knew that music was math. It was universal. You could figure out all of this stuff by studying the math in it. So for him, math was more than math. It was philosophy. The heavens, the earth, the universe, beyond what we could see, beyond what we could hear, the universe itself was math. He takes these thoughts further when he starts to study space. He starts to study the sky. He looks at the stars, and he sees this harmony that he figured out with math and with music. He sees these harmonies in the same way when he looks to the stars. He actually proposed that the earth was spherical, which is way ahead of its time at the time. Now, there are tales that he wasn't the one who proposed it and was actually attributed to him by mistake, if you want to call it that, but we'll find out later it wasn't a mistake. Either way, he was credited with looking and seeing that the earth, theorizing the earth was spherical, and then he was also credited with realizing that the morning star and the evening star that they saw were the same star, and that star, of course, being Venus. His vision of space and the cosmos, it was all spiritual. Okay, that's how he understood it. To him, he understood these bodies in the sky, these stars. They weren't just static, bright objects, but they were spheres. Each planet was special, and to him, each one produced a sound that you couldn't hear. It was inaudible to mortals, is what he said. But you could theorize that these sounds were there because of math. It was all part of the same divine composition. Now, these are beautiful words and a beautiful way to put it. It's also pretty unlikely, but here's the deal. Pythagoras is more than just a mathematician. Okay, these thoughts that he has, the way he represents the universe, it turns him into something more. It turns him into a mystic, a prophet of numbers, and really a myth. And he leans into that first of all. But by the time Pythagoras returns to Greece, he's already had these fantastical teachings and studies under these other religious and spiritual advisors. He's talked to people other people don't talk to. He's traveled further, he's studied longer, and he's a deeper thinker than anyone of his age. And he's not done. His reputation is going to grow. The less certain anyone was about what he had actually done made his reputation bigger. They credit him with inventing music, astronomy, ethics itself. Even his followers couldn't agree with what exactly he invented. The man who saw numbers in everything had become a mysterious equation himself. No one ever was able to solve him. But for all of these credits and these inventions that he had, all this philosophy and this astronomical attributions, it's not his most extraordinary creation. The most extraordinary thing that Pythagoras was able to do in his life was create a movement of philosophy, science, math, and mysticism into something that followed him. So by the time that Pythagoras returned to Greece, he was no longer just a scholar. He was a phenomenon. He came back and he carried with him a new way of thinking. He said truth could be found not in myths or the gods, but that numbers were the truth. In fact, he kind of stated numbers were God. But it was also this idea of numbers being a myth, a legend, that turned him into also a myth and a legend. In the centuries that followed, historians, poets, a ton of scholars, philosophers, they all kind of just took an amalgamation of his life. I don't know if I said that word right, but I'm gonna keep it in because that's a big word. And they wove it into a tapestry of legend, and a lot of that legend was not necessarily facts. What was his biography eventually became a hagiography. He became a legend. We've already talked about his mother receiving the prophecy at Delphi that her son is going to be of great beauty, wisdom, and he's going to benefit humankind. So, of course, whenever he was born, she named him Pythagoras, and in honor of the Pythian Apollo, the god of light and reason. He was born as a way to honor reason. He's already started his journey of reasoning with the world when he was born. But some ancient writers went even further than that. They claim that before his birth, Pythagoras was visited by Apollo. She was visited, and he, being Apollo, blessed her womb to birth Pythagoras. They say that that when Pythagoras was born, he literally shone with light as a mark of divine favor. I mean, just imagine like Hercules, the animated movie by Disney, whenever he is literally glowing radiance. That is what these legends are saying. And I know that to us, we can obviously say, hey, those are legends. This is all embellished. Of course, that didn't happen. Yes, we know that. But to the Greeks, they were expressing the greatness that Pythagoras meant to them. The story of Pythagoras' teachers, once he grows up, his tutors is the better word for that. They're just as grand as his birth. He's said to have studied with again, I don't have a degree in Greek names. So, Hermodamus of Samos, Bias of Priene, Theos, and Anaximander. Some of the greatest minds in the Greek world. But we're going to go further than that because we can't just stop at the simple with Pythagoras, okay? They also say that he learned from Orpheus, the bard who could charm beasts and trees, and then of Pherecydes of Syros, who called him the wisest of men, even wiser than him. But the Pythagoras' teachers, his tutors, are also of legend, which means that he is, of course, of legend. Every time they talked about Pythagoras, whether from his birth or his teachings or his travels, they are placing him into a chain of enlightenment that stretches from the mortals to the demigods. And then once he passes away, once we get to the point where he becomes immortalized, he goes into godhood. So this is an issue for modern day scholars, because it's very hard for scholars nowadays to separate the truth from devotion. We see it with George Washington as well, but Walter Burkitt, who we've talked about once before, he wrote, "There is not a single detail in the life of Pythagoras that stands uncontradicted. Pythagoras' life was embellished so much we don't know what's true. For every reliable fragment that we have about Pythagoras, there is another story that bends it towards the divine, the supernatural. When one account says he studies mathematics, another one says he spoke with rivers. One account says he is a philosopher, another says he is a prophet. We have to explore the beliefs about Pythagoras to fully understand Pythagoras." Some of these beliefs include, of course, we talked about him traveling the world, going to Egypt, being initiated into the sacred rite of Thebes, which reportedly he is the only foreigner to ever be granted that honor. We also say he went to Babylon, where some scholars say he learned the Pythagorean theory. Others, not scholars is the wrong word. Some philosophers say that he studied astronomy and geometry with the Chaldean priests, and then he went to Persia and he learned the doctrines of the Magi. There's no definitive proof for these journeys, but they do serve a greater truth, the truth of the Pythagoreans, that his philosophy was a fusion of science, mysticism, ritual, all gathered from other lands, other devotions, other divinities. Some sources claim he even took part in the Eleusinian mysteries. These are secret initiations that promised insight into life, death, and rebirth. There's actually kind of like another Greek cult, which is really cool as well. We might get to that at some point, but he did. Some sources claim he took part of it, but he was never actually fully initiated into the Eleusinian cult. We actually don't even know that's true, but it does present someone who is actively trying to explore these kinds of mystical elements. He didn't want to just explore them, understand it. He wanted to frame it in a mathematical sense. It's also said that he had a golden thigh, which is actually a symbol of divine lineage. And then, of course, like we said earlier, rivers were claimed to have spoken his name as he crosses them. And then, as we get further on into the cult, one of their beliefs is reincarnation. And the cult reportedly said that he remembered each one of his past lives. There's tales that animals obeyed him. He tamed a bear in the mountains by whispering to it, "Turn away and never harm another creature," and it reportedly did. I don't know how they got information. If the animal is gone, if he says leave and the animal leaves, how are they going to get information? Regardless, the stories about him, they're embellishing him. They tell us more about the belief about Pythagoras than the actual man Pythagoras. They reflect what others saw him as, obviously not just a philosopher, but as essentially a demigod. By the time he goes back to the Greek colony of Croton, where he settles down, his reputation had outgrown him. He was extremely popular as a philosopher, as a teacher, and so when he gets there, he's going to be greeted in that same way. He's going to be greeted as a prophet, as a visionary. He's going to gather men and women. They are going to come to him. They're going to hear him speak. They're going to find a man who spoke of ethics and virtue, of the harmony between numbers and nature, and then the possibility of purifying one's soul through that same knowledge. It was philosophy, but it was more like an enlightenment. So those students, the people that come to hear him talk, they transcend studenthood. they become disciples. And Pythagoras enjoyed it. He said, yes, be my disciples. Come follow me, listen to me. He encouraged it. He structured their lives, dictated their diets, and created rituals for them to study and reflect. He created a community devoted to following him and his teachers. And that is going to happen, and then it's going to grow even stronger than he ever imagined. When Pythagoras arrived in Croton around 530 BC, he brought with him a following of people. Like we talked about, he was already someone that gained power. He had power with him. He was a traveler or sage, and he was building this legacy of divinity. Croton was prosperous before he was there. Place of wealth, debate, athletes, orators. But when he came back, Pythagoras is going to build something the world had not quite seen before. A community, and I mean a very true to the word community, devoted to harmony, both of mind and of soul, and the foundation of order, devoted to numbers. The group that is created is called the Pythagoreans, named of course after Pythagoras, but they themselves called themselves a theasos, a religious brotherhood. Their structure is going to be disciplined, is going to be more disciplined than other cults, and is going to be more spiritual than any school around. They are really going to combine this cult-like mentality with a school of thought. Historians date the founding of the first Pythagorean community to 530 BC, and its members come from across Greece. You've got men and women, young and old. All of these people are drawn together by Pythagoras' reputation and his promise of enlightenment. At its height, the movement may have counted nearly 1,000 followers, all living under a very strict code of behavior. In order to join the Pythagorean cult, one had to surrender all personal possessions to the collective, take an oath of loyalty, and then undergo 5 years of silence. This was not punishment to them, it was purification. Pythagoras believed that silence trained the soul to listen, not just the words, but to listen to the harmony of the universe itself. So the cult was built around this idea of solidarity and solitude, learning by listening, not participating. You have to cleanse yourself and learn. Only after this long initiation could a student then hear the teachings directly. They weren't allowed to come into contact with the higher ups like Pythagoras and some of his close confidants. They were not allowed to go near them. They had to stick within the students. They had to purify themselves before even stepping foot in Pythagoras' presence. The Pythagorean Brotherhood followed a way of life built around balance and moderation. Their motto was all things in common among friends. So they lived communally. They shared property and they cared for one another as equals. Whenever we talked earlier about joining the cult, you had to give up your possessions. You are giving your possessions to the cult to share with everyone in the cult. What's interesting about this is if you decided to leave the cult, you could, first of all, but second of all, they would give you your possessions back. It was truly a choice to join the cult. Even more radical for the time, women held positions of learning and leadership within the order. Among them was Theano of Croton, which was Pythagoras' wife, who would later lead the school after his death. There was also other women like, bear with me here, Pericteon, Aesara of Luciana, and Phytus of Sparta, who wrote treatises on philosophy, ethics, and virtue. Some of the earliest recorded works by women in Western thought. These women are some of the earliest philosophers in Western world, and they were a part of Pythagoras' cult. The women didn't merely follow his teachings, they expanded upon them. They applied them to the idea of harmony, to family, to governance, to society. They were, true to the word, philosophers who held equal positions within this cult. Some of the other rules of the Brotherhood: the daily life of a Pythagorean was governed by precision, made up by Pythagoras, of course. They rose before dawn, studied math and music, and then ended the day in reflection and a quiet conversation. One of the most interesting things about the cult is they were vegetarians. Part of it was for health reasons, but they were vegetarians for spiritual reasons. Pythagoras, he believed in reincarnation. We will touch upon that later, but he believed in reincarnation, and that is going to drive his thought about veganism. He thought to kill an animal was to disrupt the cosmic balance of life. He was also afraid to think that at any point in time, he could be resurrected into an animal after his death, and then that animal could be killed. He didn't want to be a part of that cycle, so he avoided animals. One of the most interesting beliefs in this cult as well was beans, specifically fava beans. The Pythagoreans were forbidden to eat them. Pythagoras theorized that these beans were sacred. He believed that they contained the souls of the dead, and that eating them, of course, would release those souls. Now, modern scientists, modern historians say that is attributed to, of course, flatulence, to gas from the beans, and they thought that whenever you farted from these beans, you lost part of your soul. Regardless, that was a rule. It became one of the cult's most famous features, and it actually influences Pythagoras' death later. For Greeks outside of the Pythagorean community, they thought that this was an extraordinary cult, an extraordinary community, mainly for its equality. In a world where hierarchy ruled, Pythagoras taught that all souls were of one essence, and they were all on their journey towards perfection. A wealthy merchant could study beside a farmer. A woman could speak beside a statesman. Status, birth, and wealth had no bearing on your position within the Brotherhood. Your virtue and your intellect did. The ideals of shared knowledge and mutual respect would later influence Greek philosophy for years to come. Plato, when he imagines his republic, many of its communal and ethical principles can trace their roots back to Pythagoras' visions in Croton and how the early cult operated. Another strange thing for the Pythagoreans was the pentagram. So they obviously liked math and they liked geometry. So whenever we talk about the cult and the way they operated, their secret sign to each other to identify fellow members of the cult was the pentagram. It was a symbol of health, and it was a symbol of unity of all 5 elements, so they're going to use it to identify themselves. Each line in the pentagram, each angle in the pentagram is going to represent mathematical perfection, a harmony of ratios, and geometry that reflects the structure of the universe. For them, drawing a pentagram was literally worship. It was an act of reverence. The Pythagoreans wanted to create order out of chaos. They are going to wall themselves off, buckle down in Croton, and study the universe to make sense of it in their own way. For the Pythagoreans, this was the main goal: create order. Everything in the universe, from the movement of the stars to the beating of the heart, could be rationalized through patterns, ratios, geometry, symmetries, math. To study math was to study the divine. It is a religious practice for them. Pythagoras taught numbers are not human inventions, but reality itself. They are eternal, unchanging, and sacred. Each number is going to carry a meaning. Number 1 is going to represent unity, the source of all things, divine intellect itself. Number 2 is diversity, the tension between opposites, between matter and thought, male and female, light and darkness. 3 is going to represent harmony, the joining of opposites, the synthesis of beginning, middle, and end. 4 is going to represent justice and physical elements, earth, air, fire, water, those kind of elements. 10 is perfection. It was sacred to them. It was the sacred tetractys. The sum of the first 4 numbers believed to contain the entire nature of existence. I don't think I said that right. Regardless of whether I say it right, the Pythagoreans would swear an oath upon it, saying, by that pure, holy tetractys, which contains the root and source of ever-flowing nature. They were declaring mathematics and divinity are one and the same. And that's going to extend into not just numbers, but geometry as well. I mean, that's the whole thing about Pythagoras, right? A squared plus b squared equals c squared. It's a triangle. It talks about triangles. He's going to talk about geometry. So in their study of geometry, they see geometry as a sacred bridge between the physical and the spiritual. Triangles, squares, pentagons, they're going to be a blueprint of reality. We could talk about the pentagon, health and balance. All of it is going to align the Pythagoreans with the cosmos. They believed that these mathematical ratios controlled musical notes as well. The 4th and 5th octaves are going to be specific numerical relationships. They also used music as a means of purification as well. They believed they could restore order to the human soul just like you could tune a lyre. Soft lyre and flute tones rise and blend. They are music. They are math. They are the universe. Pythagoras extends this further than anyone else does. He proposes the entire universe produces music. Each planet has music. In its orbit, they give off notes. Together, they're going to form something called the music of spheres, a vast, eternal symphony of the cosmos. Now, he also said no one could hear it. We were born within the cosmos, so we couldn't hear the sound of existence itself, but it was so constant and so perfect, it just became silence to us. Of course it was silence, right? But it doesn't matter, because whether that was poetry by Pythagoras or a genuine belief of the cult, you're going to see this echo throughout centuries of philosophy, astronomy, and musicians. It remains one of Pythagoras' most prolific legacies, that creation itself is harmony. And now we get to one of the most defining beliefs about Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, the belief of the soul. They thought and they taught that the soul was immortal. It was bound in a cycle of metempsychosis. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but I'm going to continue to say that. Metempsychosis, the continual reincarnation of all living things. Pythagoras believed in reincarnation. He believed that when the body dies, the soul is going to be reborn, either as another person or as an animal. They are going to be travelers in an endless chain of existence. In order to escape that endless chain of existence, they needed to live virtuously, live in harmony, and then refine the soul to bring it closer to liberation from this cycle. They believed you could transcend this livelihood, this universal reincarnation, and eventually, once you transcend it, you would join the gods in eternal perfection. This belief was a core to the Pythagoreans. It connected their ethics, their science, and their religion into a single system. How you live your life affected not only you, but the universe itself. Because of this belief, that is why the Pythagoreans were vegans. They embraced non-violence. They abstained from animal sacrifice, including to eat them. They abstained from war, from cruelty. They were complete and totally peaceful. Iamblichus later wrote that Pythagoras taught He who abhors the slaughter of other living things will think it is far more unjust to kill a man. Their veganism was doctrine. It was a part of their religion. The avoidance of fava beans was a part of their religion. All of these things were proof of one's devotion to purity within the cult of Pythagoreanism. To live like this required control. So they had boundaries. They walled themselves off from society. Their secret knowledge, their strange rituals, and their silence begin to separate them from the world, and then the walls physically separated them from the world. They were peaceful, but their and Pythagoras' growing influence and mystery starts to rub some people the wrong way. They're going to begin to have some trouble from the outside. The same things that brought them together also made them a target to others. The cult's influence spread. It spread into politics, into philosophy, and into Croton as the island itself. But power, in the days of the Greek world, even in the modern day, power rarely goes unquestioned. To many in Croton, the Brotherhood's secrecy and their discipline and their strangeness were unsettling. They were too united, too controlled. They were a society within a society that answered to no one but Pythagoras. And that man, Pythagoras, revered as a philosopher to his followers, was seen as a dangerous cult leader, a mystic. One of these enemies that Pythagoras had, his name was Cylon. He was an ambitious citizen of Croton who sought to join the order of Pythagoreanism, and he was actually rejected. So he got rejected and it hurt. He turned his bitterness, it built up inside of him. And eventually, when the Pythagoreans kind of manipulate an election in Croton, he gets his followers together and he accuses Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans of arrogance and corruption that they are using to manipulate the city. In this issue, Cylon was able to create an opening. He gathered a faction of supporters, he grabbed them, and he turned this faction, this unrest going on, towards the cult of Pythagoreanism. According to legend, Pythagoreans were meeting one evening in a house near the edge of Croton when Cylon and his men surrounded it. They barred the doors from the outside and they lit it on fire. Inside, flames spread through the hall where students and masters had once debated the harmonies. Where students and masters had once debated the harmony of the cosmos. Many of the Pythagoreans perished in this fire. They burned to death, but some did escape. Although it would alter the cult of Pythagorean forever. It would never be the same again. So, of course, with a legend like this, we don't know the whole story. And there's going to be different ways to tell it. Some accounts say that Pythagoras actually wasn't present at this meeting where the house burned down. They say he was away on the island of Delos, tending to a dying friend. Others say that he actually was there and that he escaped the burning building and fled with a handful of followers. So let's explore those a little bit, okay? One tradition recorded by Deified tells that after the fire, Pythagoras escaped with his followers. They were then pursued into the countryside. They reached a field of fava beans, the one food, the one vegetable that his teaching said we cannot touch these. Pythagoras, according to legend, was so steadfast in his religion that he refused to cross the field. He refused to break his own rule. The capturers caught him and they killed him. Another tale says that he survived the fire with his followers and they escaped the building, went to a nearby town. That town wouldn't harbor them. So he traveled for another 40 days in mourning, and that him and his followers starved to death. There's also another tale told by Porphyria. Again, I'm sorry about the Greek names. This one's probably my favorite. This one insists that with the fire broke out, Pythagoras had to escape, and that his disciples quite literally laid down across a river so that he could use their bodies as stepping stones to get to safety, where they sacrificed themselves and they drowned. Now, of course, none of these can actually be proven, but we do begin to see this narrative. In Pythagoras' death, he's going to be remembered not as a man who liked math, but as a man of faith, a figure that is going to transcend a normal human death. Okay, normal people don't get heroic deaths. They don't get religious deaths. They get normal deaths. Pythagoras is going to rise above that. In the years that follow the cult's kind of dissemblance, survivors are going to flee across Greece. They're going to flee into southern Italy. Some are going to reform small communities. Others are going to just kind of quietly carry along the teachings of Pythagoras and blend them into the local philosophy. The original cult is gone. The harmony, the numbers, the meetings on Croton, it is finished. But something else is going to happen. The death of Pythagoras is going to allow the cult to raise him up to a higher power. They're going to give him a new status. Instead of just being a teacher, cult leader, he's going to become a martyr for wisdom and religion. In the years that followed Pythagoras' death, his followers spread across the Greek world. They carried fragments of his philosophy, his rituals, but most importantly, they carried his legend. In that legend, Pythagoras became something greater than a philosopher. He became a symbol of divine reason. The stories of Pythagoras grew even more after his death, okay? They were already fantastical. They're going to get more fantastical. His followers are going to start saying things like, oh, Pythagoras predicted earthquakes. He healed the sick. He spoke to the dead. His followers claimed he could see into the future, that he literally went to the underworld and returned to tell everyone what he saw in the underworld. They said he possessed perfect memory, where he recalled not every detail of his life, but he recalled all the details of the lives he lived before, the ones that he reincarnated from. He was a Trojan hero. He was a son of Hermes. He said he had lived 1,000 times and remembered each of those times. In time, his legend is going to grow, and he is going to cease being a man at all. He becomes a messenger of the gods, a conduit between heaven and earth, and a prophet to bring the world of chaos to order. Of course, through math. That never left his legend. He was always rooted in mathematical properties and the geometry of the universe. So we're going to get two separate traditions emerging after his death. Okay, the followers of Pythagoreanism are going to split into two schools. Oh boy. All right. So the Akusamatoi, or the listeners in English, are going to be the ones who preserve his moral and religious teachings. They're going to emphasize things like purity, discipline, and the mystical interpretation of numbers. They are not going to create new doctrine. They're not going to try and evolve the current thoughts of Pythagoreanism. Now we're going to go to the other side, the mathematikoi, the learners. They're going to focus on science. They're going to focus on studying geometry, astronomy, and the logical structure of the world. The big thing about these guys is they're going to continue on Pythagorean studies. They're going to try and use his doctrines to unlock more and more things, advanced math, advanced science, advanced astronomy, geometry, all of it. They are going to try and advance the world using Pythagoreanism. Each side is going to claim to be the true heirs of Pythagoras. And each one is going to kind of have some suspicion about the other, to the akusumatikoi, the mathematicians were actual heretics. They were not what Pythagoras wanted. They were not how Pythagoras would have wanted the cult to carry on after his death. But to the mathematicoi, the listeners, they weren't seen in such a negative light. They were simply old traditionalists trapped in superstition and the traditions of the older ones. So they weren't as hostile as the akusumatikoi, but both carried a part of him. They both carried, one side was reason, reverence, the other was logic and faith. One sought to advance, one sought to teach his ways. Through these two schools, Pythagoras' thoughts, they're going to find its way into Greek philosophy as a whole. One of his later followers, Pythagoras of Tarentum, was a mathematician and a statesman. He firmly believed in Pythagorean ideals. He also was a mentor to a young philosopher named Plato. Plato absorbed the Pythagorean ideas through the world of architects who taught him and mentored him. So Plato is going to present these numbers and harmonies into the bloodstream of Western thought. We see these kinds of ideas in Plato's Republic, Kepler's cosmic symmetries, the Renaissance geometry, natural law. All of these are going to be influenced by Pythagorean ideals. The ideas that Pythagorean brought forward were popular for nearly 8 centuries. They then get revived again in a Neo-Pythagorean movement in the 1st century BCE. And then they get revived again when that Neo-Pythagoreanism turns into Neoplatonism, which is going to blend mathematics, mysticism, metaphysics into one grand scheme. Pythagoras never goes away. In every age after his death, he reappears to present his ideas under other philosophical studies. Pythagoras' influence lingers to this day. We speak of musical harmony, geometric symmetry, orbits, proportions, everything that he has taught, that he thought of, we still speak of today. His legacy is literally carved in every classroom and textbook. A squared plus B squared equals C squared still lingers in the mind of every adult and child like a freaking sleeper code, waiting for us to just pounce at the ability to say, oh yeah, Pythagoras, A squared plus B squared equals C squared. He still has a major influence on the world. We're never going to understand what Pythagoras was actually like. We in the modern day are going to try and separate the man from the myth, but the ancient world made Pythagoras larger than life. And that was because of his cult. They did a wonderful job of crafting a legacy that lives on today. Pythagoras was a teacher. He was a philosopher. He was a man who held power. And in that power, he spoke his truth. And that truth is, the universe is made up of numbers. And with that, today's journey comes to an end. If you enjoyed our time together, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And if you have any recommendations for future topics or stories you'd like to explore, let me know in the comments. Until next time, stay curious.